My pleasure to be here today, and also so pleased to have Greg with us today. I'm not sure how many of you will have got through Greg's book as yet, but it is an incredibly detailed, meticulous history of beer, the beverage that I love and many New Zealanders love. And in fact, it's got a very strong and storied place in New Zealand society and culture and politics as well, which we'll get a little bit into today. But first of all, I know why I would write a book about beer, but I am very interested in you just giving us an idea of why you wrote about this book and what led to this. Where did it all start?
Thanks, Denise. Kia ora koutou katoa. Lovely to see everybody late in the afternoon. Yeah, I suppose there's a certain logic. I did an MA on Māori rugby and a PhD on cricket, so there is something to be said for finding the next one of your hobbies and turning that into an academic research interest. Funnily enough, this actually started in New Zealand, in Belgium, not in New Zealand. We were changing trains in the middle of Belgium on the way back from a tour of First World War battlefields and had an hour to kill in a railway station cafe, and I guess most people, railway station cafes, unhappy sausage rolls, tired lamingtons. This one had high-end Belgian beer, Rodenbach, Westmalle, various cherry lambics and all sorts of things, and it inevitably led to a conversation between Liz and I, my strongest critic, editor, research assistant in the front row. Why does Belgium have the beer culture that it has? Why does New Zealand have what it has? I still don't understand Belgium. I think I understand a bit more about New Zealand, but it really, to me, in terms of New Zealand history, all we'd really heard about was temperance and prohibition campaigns and how the likes of Masterton became a dry district and parts of the Wairarapa generally. I thought there was a whole lot more from the perspective of the drinker. And we hadn't actually gone dry. We tried to, but because we hadn't, I thought there's a lot more there about beer history in New Zealand and where we'd come from.
And it's been a bit of a long time coming, this book as well. You failed to mention just how long ago that...
Yeah, this is a slightly sensitive point. I made the mistake earlier. Look, piece of advice for anybody about to write a book, don't tell people that you're writing it. It wears a bit thin after a while. That Belgian railway station cafe was in 2002. The book finally came out last year. In my defence, I'd written quite a lot of the first half by late 2009, and then I got sucked into university senior management for the best part of a decade. Finally escaped from that, apart from university proctor, which is student discipline and therefore quite busy, especially at Lincoln. So I escaped from that. And look, in some ways, I'm actually glad that it took probably 10 or 12 years longer than it should have, because I think a book written in 2012, for all sorts of reasons, would have been a different book than the one that came out. Well, it was going to be 10 chapters. It became 11, but there were a whole bunch of themes off the last decade and a bit of the craft beer debate. What is craft beer? Does it matter? Some of the big breweries taking over some of the smaller breweries. There's a whole raft of things that, with hindsight, which historians should never use, I'm glad it's taken as long as it did.
And we'll get into some of that, I guess, a little bit of history repeating itself. But I think we should start at the start, as it were. How did it all begin here in New Zealand? Where did it start for New Zealand's favourite alcoholic beverage?
Scurvy. In simple terms, the first beer brewed here was by the crew of Captain Cook's second voyage down at Dusky Sound in April 1773. I think you can only get to the first brewing site if you know somebody with a helicopter. Certainly not accessible otherwise. And quite seriously, the British Admiralty at the time were looking for cures for scurvy, which was the scourge of long sea voyages. So many people were dying. This was in 150 years before vitamin C is properly identified and isolated. There was a notion that scurvy was sort of a disease of putrefaction, so that if you had something that fermented, something that bubbled, kind of keeps the gut and the system moving, that might be a preventative for scurvy. And there was an element too of, it had happened in North America, of brewing with spruce and other things. So that, in simple terms, was the motivation. Cook was using so many things, sauerkraut, carrot marmalade, the works, that his crews didn't get scurvy, but it wasn't actually due to beer, and it took the British Navy another 20 years to work out that actually beer as a preventative for scurvy was not a good idea. But look, the other part of it, put simply, and why they even wanted to explore beer on long sea voyages is, of course, New Zealand was settled by a beer drinking culture, not a wine drinking culture, not the Italians or others. Beer was staple beverage, and it was always essential if you were going to have British settlement out here, that at some point you would have to provide beer. Not some historians have got really excited by, they were 12,000 miles from home and they were dislocated and they needed alcohol as some sort of psychological prop to cope with the isolation. No, it was cultural. People were beer drinkers. It was a normal thing to do. If they'd wanted the psychological prop to obliterate themselves, they would have just drunk spirits, of which there were plenty about. But people went out of their way to grow hops, to brew beer, to build breweries, all of those things, just because it's essential and it's cultural. It's not alcohol. Alcohol is almost, in a sense, the last thing that it's about.
Also, in terms of those early years, I think there was a lot of excitement as well in terms of when, those who came over from the UK realised just what kind of temperatures and ground soil and things we had in terms of it being quite a beer drinker's paradise almost, in terms of creating that beverage right here on our shores.
Yeah, it's a bit of a cliche these days, but it was realised very early that we could make good beer and the Australians couldn't. What that was, the climate. It was interesting in the 19th century, probably half of the breweries in Australia or more in about mid-century were in Tasmania, which had a relatively temperate climate. It was realised relatively quickly here that the climate was fairly similar to that of Britain, and where you have the Australian colonies and parts of North America really struggling to control fermentation and yeasts going wild and feral. This was a relatively familiar environment. There was good water. It was worked out fairly early. In Nelson in the 1840s. It had already been worked out. These were ideal hop growing conditions, but actually other parts of the country later on. In that sense, it was familiar and relatively easy compared with some other spots.
Also, in these early years, though, it didn't stop, those in charge to try and put some controls right from early on.
Well, there's a constant debate goes on because what New Zealanders, as with the North American colonies and even Australia in 18th, 19th century, they're new world societies, they're new colonial settings. So part of that is, why are people here? Well, they're here because they're trying to get away from the old world and some of the vices or the class systems or the congestion. So there's part of a sense, what do we do to make a new world society? And there's one strong element, of course, is that you don't waste all of your money and your resources on drink. We want hard-working people. If you can work hard, save, you can buy yourself land, you can buy a farm. This was at a time probably when 80% of the land in Britain's owned by 5% of the population. So you get this really strong notion in the colonies of there's a temperance and then a prohibition movement comes through. All things in moderation, temperate behaviour, that will be your key to success. And so in New Zealand, and certainly in North America. Less so in Australia because there's a larger Irish Catholic population, which takes a lot more convincing about the evils of alcohol. And I'm of Irish Catholic ancestry, so there's no judgment. There's a reason behind that. But right from the beginning, there are really strong sort of temperance societies. They curb Sunday trading in pubs by the 1860s. Then they sort of move into various licensing measures where communities could vote to decide, do we want pubs in our locality? If so, what opening hours do we want? And so, yeah, it comes through very strongly, whereas those same movements, they weren't really taking hold in Britain and Europe to anything like the same way, because the cultures of drinking and of the pub and community were just so entrenched that you were never going to sort of push them aside. But clean slate, you've sort of possibly got a chance.
Things, I guess, there was a lot of tension in New Zealand in terms of that beer drinking culture right through those early years. But there was a bit of change with both the industry and the culture as we approached that First World War and then into the Second World War as well.
Yeah, I would maintain the wars are absolutely crucial. So I guess to go back a step, by around about 1900, we had something like 100 breweries. There were some bigger ones starting to come through. Most of the beer is probably 6 to 8% ABV, so it's quite strong. Things like Scotch ale styles, which was what Speight's were actually renowned for brewing. First World War comes along, there's a couple of things. People had worked out much earlier, of course, beer is good, or any alcohol is good for governments to produce revenue, excise. So, First World War, they introduced a sliding scale, which is if you wish to brew beer at a higher strength, that's fine, but you will pay a much higher excise on it. So that discourages some of the brewers. And so after 1915, very quickly the average strength of beer drops from somewhere between, say, 6 to 8% down to about 5%. And then the other thing, as a wartime sort of efficiency measure, they suggested that the pubs ought to be closed at 6 o'clock. Have a drink after work and then go home. This, despite actually, and I was reminded yesterday as I had a look at the site of the Featherston camp, Colonel Noel Adams, the commander of the Featherston camp, said, there is no evidence of problems of drunkenness among the troops. We don't need these measures. But New Zealand introduced 6 o'clock closing in September 1917 for the duration of the war and 6 months beyond. And then sneakily at the end of 1918, by one vote on a cold night in Parliament when everyone was half asleep, it was made permanent. And I guess, even now, when people hear 6 o'clock closing, they think swill. There's no evidence of swilling for about right through the interwar period, 20s and 30s. You don't see it in dictionaries or anything. So that became the Second World War's great contribution to New Zealand beer. 1942, government decided again as a sort of partly as a health and wellbeing measure and to increase productivity, to legislate the beer strength down, so that with the exception of a little bit of stout, you could not brew above a specific gravity of 1036. And the brewers can tell me probably 3.6, 3.8% alcohol by volume, depending on the starting gravity. So suddenly we had much weaker beer. Speight's were absolutely stuffed because they could no longer brew their strong beer and send it all over the country. It had no keeping qualities. What happens when you lower the beer strength? People drink more to get the same alcoholic effect, and it's almost immediate. You can see there aren't any consumption stats during the war. The moment the consumption stats come back in in 1945, the physical volume of beer that is being drunk is just going up and up and up dramatically. People are drinking more of this stuff to get the same effect, and of course they're drinking it by 6 p.m. That's when you get the swilling. That's when you get the rapid consumption, and then the breweries adapting to it. Don't want the beer too fizzy. It is really hard to drink fizzy carbonated beer at high speed. The pubs don't need that many amenities because people are pretty much there for one reason between 5 and 6. So I think it's not 6 o'clock closing, it's the lowering of the beer strength that changes that whole culture into the 40s, 50s, 60s and creates the swill.
And we did also, as you mentioned there, the keeping quality change. So there was a lot more of a localised drinking, and also that chance for some of those smaller brands and more locally produced breweries to, I guess, make more of a name for themselves.
To a limited degree, but what had happened was as early as the 1870s, you had some of the bigger breweries. If somebody's brewing good beer and they've got a bit of resource behind them, then it's easy to squeeze out the competition. And as early as the 1870s, you actually have reports of small breweries in towns like Milton. We're being squeezed out by breweries in Dunedin that can put their beer on trains and get them out here, and even at that cost, still make a profit. So actually what had happened before the First World War, and certainly by the Second, the number of breweries had probably decreased by about 60%. The big ones are starting to emerge. And so even when you get that stage of what you would think would be ideal environments in the 40s and 50s for local breweries to produce local beer because it's not going far, the reality is that most of them have been squeezed out. There are a few that do quite well. There's a couple on the West Coast that do very good stout, and there are others. But this is when you get beer being moved around by tanker. It's that whole economies of scale to get vast amounts of beer out to be consumed. So it created, in a sense, an ideal environment, but there were not that many breweries left to take advantage of it.
Speaking of big breweries, much of New Zealand's history is impacted by the two big breweries in New Zealand, DB and Lion.
Yep.
Explain to us sort of how this came to be, and just how strong that duopoly was.
Lion makes sense to me, DB makes no sense to me. That could be a mantra I have into the present, but I'll be careful. No, so Lion comes out of a series of amalgamations. There were some of the breweries in Dunedin, Speight and some of the others had started amalgamating sort of prior to 1914. There were 3 major breweries in Auckland, 3 in Christchurch, 2 in Wellington. And in the early 20s, it became clear to them that prohibition was a threat. We nearly went dry twice in 1919. The first one we did go dry until the votes of the soldiers came back from overseas. The second one, New Zealand avoided going dry by, I think, about 1,600 votes in the end. So in the 20s, there's a real notion that the industry is under threat, and proposals emerge actually really quite quickly. They almost take the country by surprise that 10 big breweries, we're going to form a consortium. And for a while, it was sort of local breweries doing their thing under the Lion banner, but over time they standardised the product and the systems. So Lion came into being in 1923 as an amalgamation of 10 breweries, and then 1930, in the middle of economic depression, now this is after the Wall Street crash, it is not a logical time for anybody to be setting up a business. But somehow Henry Callagher takes over another Auckland brewery that had been run by the Coots family, and somehow gets a toehold in the Auckland market. Originally bottle sales, because most of the pubs were being controlled by Lion, and I still struggle to get my head around it sometimes, how on earth DB survived the 1930s, but they managed to. By the Second World War, they're probably about 20% of the market. Where they really took off was after the end of 6 o'clock closing, and they were able to buy up some of the last of the regional breweries, some in Taranaki, the Tui Brewery at Mangatanoka, some on the West Coast, and they really come into their own, especially in the 70s, by which time you have precisely 2 brewing companies. And the process is, so I always find it disturbing that they don't refer to breweries quite often, they refer to brewing plants, which makes it sound very scientific, very industrial. And DB in particular, with continuous fermentation, which sort of lend a bit to the title of the book, they're really very good. scientific brewers.
How about we touch on this tide taps concept? Obviously, this was something that really helped Lion get quite a foothold and become, I guess, I'm not sure if monolith is the correct term, but quite the large entity that we even know today. Tide taps, how did sort of that come to be, and how has that sort of continued right through to today?
Well, funnily enough, the first tide houses, as they were termed in New Zealand, were actually in Nelson in the 1840s. So when you have commercial brewers, so no longer just say home brewing or family brewing, brewers of course need outlets, and so some of them start to work out, well, there's two ways we can do this. If we've got enough resource, we will buy a pub, and then we will use that to sell our beer, or perhaps we will lend money to publicans to help them refurbish their pubs. And this, by the 1890s, when you've got licensing committees that really want local prohibition, or at the very least they're putting increasing pressure on the pub trade, and they're demanding, and if you want to renew your licence, you have to have a much better quality of premises. Who's going to lend you the money? The banks aren't going to lend you the money, because if there's a risk if your district goes dry, they're not going to get it back. The only people who are going to lend you the money are the brewers. So there's a number of different ways. The brewers either own the pubs, or they tie the publicans by virtue of loans and debts, or agreements. Your rent is this. If you take our beer, your rent is only half of that. And so by that means they tie up a significant, probably 80% of the pubs by the early 20th century are tied, and even some of the others, if they're not tied to breweries, are probably tied to wine and spirit merchants. But it's really by those mechanisms, because all of the pubs, too, the other thing, if you wanted to own a hotel in New Zealand, it had to provide accommodation. So again, the costs of running an establishment, of equipping it with everything that was needed. And here was the obvious source of income. So yeah, they tied them by those means.
There's also been a little bit of, I guess, tying of ingredients as well, in terms of hops, malt, the ingredients that we know are incredibly crucial to the success of the beer industry.
Yeah, certainly the big breweries, relatively early in the piece, had significant investments in the malting industry, one of the big maltings in Heathcote Valley near Christchurch, but also likewise with Buxton and Co, I guess is the one I'm most familiar with, is one of the major hop brokerages in Nelson from about the 1870s. And again, the big breweries were the same. We will guarantee to purchase X amount of hops, sort of almost in bulk, every season. And when you've got that, any business wants to deal with somebody who's willing to buy the product in bulk, rather than 75 other fiddly little breweries who want relatively small amounts. So again, the whole thing is whole lots of sort of interlocking companies. I've got to confess, I still haven't got my head around all of it, but it's the brewers, it's the hop brokers, it's the maltsters, but it's also quite often the wine and spirit merchants, and then some of the other people who are in the business of buying and selling hotels, and they're all interlocked in these really extraordinarily complex interconnections. Very hard to break into that industry. It
hasn't been just the duopoly, and that's where we are today. I guess how did that duopoly of Lion and DB really become challenged?
Well, I guess the conventional account is actually the sideways answer to that is due to a rabbit farming course that never happened. Terry McCashin, who set up Max in 1981, and McCashin went to the UK, by his account at least, to explore the possibilities of rabbit farming. He was something of an entrepreneur. and got a bit distracted by the beer on offer in the UK. And this was at a time, so we're not in isolation. So in Britain, CAMRA, the Campaign for Real Ale, which had emerged in the early 70s, of trying to get back to some of the traditions, because the UK was the same. It didn't have the duopoly, it had the big six. The US had gone down a similar path. So you have got people in different parts of the world, Britain, North America in particular, looking to grow. So he, of course, came back and scraped around for equipment, quite often repurposed dairy factory materials, and set up Max in 1981. And had considerable opposition from some of the breweries, had the very, very good sense to invite the Prime Minister, Robert Muldoon, to his brewery opening. And I've got the photo of Muldoon in the book, sort of holding the beer up. Well, Muldoon was mainly a wine drinker, and a bit of schnapps the night that he called the 1984 election. But one of the very good sense of inviting the Prime Minister and saying, well, Prime Minister, this is a small business, the sort of thing that the National Party really likes in defence of the small man. It also sent a certain message to the big breweries that possibly let us get on with it. So Max certainly, and then probably the next one of those, not for 3 or 4 years, and there's a few breweries through the 80s into the early 90s. I think it's a bit deceptive because some people go, Max, craft. And I actually, like Michael Donaldson said, they weren't really craft breweries. Some of them were trying to just provide an alternative to the mainstream. And I think, Michael's description was each of those breweries brewed a yellow, an amber, and a black. And you don't even sort of give them beer styles. And so the notion that they were all craft breweries is a bit deceptive, but there's an environment that does start to emerge where, and then it intersects with whatever else some of us may think of the speed at which the fourth Labour government did things, and Rogernomics and the rest. It did start to loosen up some of that environment, where it's possible to break into the markets. But yeah, a lot of it is running in parallel with what's going on overseas. We're not in that sense unique.
I guess that takes us quite nicely into the craft beer revolution, which takes us all the way to the present day. How, I guess, did that really start to take hold in New Zealand?
I find it really intriguing because there's been quite a number of different dates as to when the revolution might have happened. I think there are some beers coming through in the 90s that are definitely craft. They're not just an alternative to the mainstream. And I think of Emerson's. I think of one of my personal favourites, Pink Elephant. And luckily, when we got married in 2003, I was followed around my own wedding by being handed pints of Pink Elephant Mammoth. So there were beers there that were definitely that alternative to the mainstream. But I think, again, a lot of it, there's an interesting shift to me, which is, and it's possibly not the only one, but some of the early brewers, I think, took their inspiration from Britain and from styles. And of course, CAMRA's thing was very much, for a long time, let's recreate some traditional beer styles. And I can remember a few of the early smaller breweries saying that. One of the interesting changes I picked up on was when more people started being influenced by the small breweries and the craft coming out of the United States, which wasn't so bound by style. We will throw 1,000 kilos of hops into this pint and see what happens, and to hell with it. So they weren't bound by style, and I think I just got the sense that there was more of that willingness to experiment in a variety of styles. So yeah, that's a part of it, I think. People going overseas and overseas influences, seeing it work in other places and having the confidence to try things. And obviously a drinking audience that, again, for a variety of reasons, is becoming more receptive to that.
And possibly quite proud as well of not even what we're doing now, but our beer history. it's quite interesting. You talk about there being a lot of breweries opening up, the big two kind of taking them over well into right from the early 90s, 19 sort of 20s and onwards. But we've seen some of that again, even post the craft beer wave beginning as well. Are you seeing a lot of these parallels in terms of what New Zealand has gone through from its very early stages and what's happening now in the last decade or so?
Oh, we're going full circle. I've always maintained that history is somewhat cyclical. Yeah, I mean, if you think in New Zealand, Lion took over Max. I mean, that was at the behest, obviously, of the McCashin family, and then later on with Emerson's and Panhead and Tuatara and founders in a different sort of way. And that is a familiar process, both in New Zealand and around the world, where new breweries come through and they get taken over in different ways, and we've seen that. And sometimes it becomes a quite emotional thing. I can remember people telling me, Max was taken over and it was ruined, and I've always thought, well, no, it wasn't. Some of the beers changed. Some of the beers had changed when they were Max. They stopped doing certain things that I absolutely loved at the time, started doing other things. I think it's a constantly changing process, and equally, I guess it's why, and it's not my usual nature to be optimistic, but there are elements here again. Last year, some good breweries were running into really tough times and going into receivership. New breweries open. Some will fall by the wayside. Some of the breweries of the last few years are really digging their toes in and becoming very significant and extremely good and internationally recognised. So I think it's an evolving process. I mean, unfortunately, some other brewery that I like will close down sometime within the next 2 or 3 years. You can guarantee that. Something else will turn up, I think. It's always happened.
On those tough economic times, it's no secret that we're in that at the moment. Can you touch on some of the things that have come about in our beer industry, in our beer culture, as a result of some of those tough economic times in the past?
Oh, I think the first one is whenever the economy got tough, the government used to like to go after excise revenue. So the very first taxes introduced on New Zealand beer, they tried in 1878 and got thwarted. The brewery said it will drive us to the wall, and then there was a huge economic crash the following year. Wool prices collapsed and various of New Zealand's other key exports. And so in 1880, they introduced an excise on beer, which was generally accepted. And then, as I said, the First World War, they ramped it up significantly to produce revenue. So that's always happened. The other interesting thing periodically during times of economic downturn has been the rise of home brew. During the 1930s depression, which is, as I say, despite the miracle of DB coming into the market, there's an estimate at the time that something over 20% of the beer produced in New Zealand is home brewed. Most of it, I suspect, undrinkable because I think it was basically a mix of Maltexo and white sugar. But they were getting to the point where customs were going after home brewers for evasion of duty, because they weren't just brewing; some of them were selling on quite a significant scale. And there was a bit of it again, the famous 1958 black budget, where the government doubled the excise on beer, and the story was that Arnold Nordmeyer, the finance minister, kind of put this up as a proposal, thinking that, we might get away with half of it, and remarkably somehow got away with a lot. It didn't help that Nordmeyer was an ordained minister and was always portrayed as being an out-and-out wowser, which I think was a little unfair. he was managing a tough economy. But again, there was a spike in home brewing after that, including the bizarre story of a whole lot of Treasury officials in the Treasury offices in Wellington brewing with various home brew kits to see exactly how they worked, what was going to be produced, and how on earth might we be able to get some duty out of this. It's just some really odd goings on.
I like how you say that some of the beer was probably undrinkable, because as a home brewer, I know that as long as you brew it, it is drinkable.
Oh, absolutely it is. But yeah, some of those recipes, as I say, and I think Maltexo actually, there were recipes where you just look at them and think, well, Maltexo and cane sugar for a start, and the odd packet of hops, but in washing machines that probably hadn't been sterilised. It's just terrifying. And my first attempt was not a lot better. I don't think Macbeth's anti-lager, named after a friend of mine from when we brewed it in 1987, was ever going to win an award for anything except for industrial chemical.
It is interesting to note that I guess in our more modern history, a lot of our very popular and even some of our largest craft brewers and breweries have actually started as home brewers as well. So maybe there's hope for you and I yet.
Oh, I've heard a number of those conversations where somebody's partner said, there comes a tipping point where if you're going to do this, you either do it on a commercial scale and try and make us a return on it, or you stop. But yeah, I think a lot of it came out of that. People, and you'll get more of it too, because people see other people doing this thing that works. Oh, somebody down the road has actually brewed something that isn't undrinkable, so maybe I can do that. And I find it fascinating now, having a little bit to do with our brewing diploma at Lincoln. We're producing students with a scientific background who are having placements in breweries, and some of the brewers are saying, this is really interesting because I don't come at it from a scientific background. I've now got the student intern who is a food scientist or something, so we're actually, we're sort of combining together. They're telling me what should happen, I'm telling them what does happen. It's a really interesting meeting of minds, some of that, and they're quite grateful.
Where art and science combine.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Speaking of art, I love how your book, not only is the cover amazing with all of those old coasters on it, but right throughout you just have like a treasure trove of all these amazing archival images. Can you talk a little bit about, where and how you found all of this, but also what it kind of shows us as like even a visual history of New Zealand's beer?
Yeah. Well, funnily enough, the covers, a lot of those beer labels are relatively easy to pick up on Trade Me, funnily enough, but some of those came out of museums and other things, but you'd be surprised what the Hocken Library at Otago, National Library in Wellington actually had quite a lot of beer and brewing ephemera. DB gave me some, but I really have to say the Lion were incredibly helpful, and they had a wonderful librarian. They had a technical library in the old brewery, and luckily their librarian Edna Carson had an interest in history. This incident was where I literally got locked in a brewery at lunchtime. I left their library, discovered that all the doors were locked, and I couldn't actually get out of the brewery until we found somebody sitting in a little laboratory in the corner. But Edna, literally until the day she retired, was emailing me images and saying, oh, this might be interesting. And it is, there are all sorts of themes through there of advertising, that is trying to make beer respectable. So you'll see, there's one image in the book which I still find completely bizarre, one of the, it's the DB Lager images, where you've got a couple sitting there in evening dress, the full tux and the long purple dress, drinking beer, and there's an attempt to sort of make beer respectable, and then you get other advertising campaigns which link it very closely to sport, which is not just about sports people drinking beer, it's about the notion of people who drink beer are fit and active. And so Lion and DB both did other advertising campaigns with people doing everything from gardening to wood chopping to hard work. So there's all of these images that are consciously trying to present beer as normal, but as respectable, but as something that you deserve after a hard day's work. Nobody's trying to present beer as alcohol. Nobody's trying to present beer as no, I'll rephrase that. There were certain big brewery advertisements of the 80s and 90s that probably were doing that, but you know what I mean. It's the whole context around it, and that you drink beer for sociability, you drink it after hard work. It's something about coming together with people, and I think that's what all of those images are aiming at. Some of them mention the taste of the stuff, not many. Look, if you think about it, you see a few beer advertisements make sort of very general observations about the taste of the stuff, but most don't. It's about scene setting and the circumstances under which you might want to drink beer. I think that's important.
I thought it was quite interesting as someone who did a lot of my growing up in the 90s and the noughties, where a lot of the beer advertising is marketed at men, how in the early days there were a lot of females depicted in the advertising, and it kind of advertises almost a health drink.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I find really intriguing again, that things went full circle. So if you go right back, medieval times and before, women were the brewers. Alewives and brewsters, it was very much a domestic thing, and then commercial brewing was taken over by men. There were women brewing in New Zealand in the 19th century, not that many. But yeah, there is a thing for a long time, and I really like the stout advertisements of the early 1930s, which again depict women drinking beer, which the New Zealand Alliance for the Suppression of the Liquor Traffic thought was absolutely appalling, but others thought, this is health giving and it's appropriate for women to be drinking beer. And then you still have women in some of the beer advertising in that context, even in the 50s. Later on, I think some of it just becomes kind of sexist and inane, and women are portrayed as that. I think I quoted one of the references to a particular beer style as being described as slapper juice, and it was that notion that the breweries were kind of thinking that the only beer that women are going to drink is light and probably infused with lime and any other additive, and we somehow moved into this culture where if women drink beer, it's a different sort of beer, and it's very odd how we kind of got there, given I think where we had been.
For sure. Well, I think we might be at the time where we take on some of your questions. So I think Ryan might be the one handing around the microphone if anyone has any questions.
Anecdotes. I know we were talking, I mentioned the tankers, about beer being delivered in tankers, and I think I can almost owe my existence to beer being delivered in tankers. My dad over there came over from Australia and saw that they were delivering beer in a tanker and said, right, they delivered in milk trucks here, sell all my stuff in Australia, I'm staying here. So yeah, thanks beer. Any questions at all? Yep.
Thank you. I thought that was really fascinating, and thank you to both of you. Really interesting. One of the things I'd be keen to pick up is that you talked mostly about, if you like, what Roger Douglas would have called the supply side. And I'm quite interested in what it was about people's changing tastes. And one of my strong recollections, I went to university in Dunedin, and in Dunedin you could not buy anything other than Speight's. You couldn't even buy Coca-Cola, believe it or not. If you wanted Coca-Cola, you had to drive up, I think, to Timaru, buy some and come back. You had a lot of people from out of town at university, and they had tasted other beers, and there would be quite violent exchanges between people, is there anything better than Speight's? And Speight's really was the worst possible thing at that time. It was just absolutely revolting. But
That Speight's was, yes.
Yeah,
Any Speight's after 1942.
it was an appalling thing. And so the question is, at what point do people realise almost that they're being sort of conned by this sort of monopolistic system, and that they start to appreciate that there are better things out there? And to a certain extent, I wondered, was that not also thanks to Roger Douglas? Because all of a sudden we could buy some beer from Belgium occasionally, and we could buy beer from America, and we did get to realise that there was a whole different world. I'd be interested on the east side of it.
There are little bits of it. I mean, on the import, some of it had even preceded Douglas, because there were loosening of some of the import rules in the earlier 80s. But I guess, just to go back a bit, I mean, there was a line that people drank what they did because that was what was there, and what was there was because people drank it, and so it sort of went round in a circle. There are always elements of other beer. There was quite a lot of import into New Zealand up until, well, it got killed off by the First World War, and there's very little import again until the 60s. There's a little bit starts coming through. Some beers, especially in the 60s, being brewed under licence. I'll get to one of those in a second. But there was also the Speight's thing. So 1960, Lion decided, look, the logic of having our different breweries around the country, pretty much brewing the same beer, we should therefore have national brands. And so they introduced Lucky. Now, the Lucky beers were apparently quite good. And the Lucky Stout, according to at least my father, was very good. They lasted about 6 months in the market because, of course, Lucky wasn't Speight's and it wasn't Waikato Draft, and it was that classic thing of brand loyalty over anything else. But I can remember someone I know used to do blind tastings at beer tastings, and said, I never yet came across a group of people who could get any more than about 40% right in terms of identifying their favourite brand as opposed to another mainstream brand. But I think Lucky was that classic triumph of, in the end, of brand over substance. But there were others coming through. I mean, the one I forgot to mention before, for residents of the Wairarapa especially, where was Guinness first brewed in New Zealand under licence? At the Tui Brewery at Mangatanoka in the early 60s for about 3 years. And so we had Guinness, we had a bit of Bass and Tennant's, and a few other lagers coming through. Certainly Heineken, because that was why Steinecker ended up being Steinlager when Heineken sued them for intellectual property breaches. So there was a bit of it about, but yeah, not much. And not much until later on when the imports open up, and also when more and more New Zealanders are going overseas to encounter what's on offer.
I'm interested what your thought is in more recent times on the introduction of low alcohol and zero alcohol beers, and how popular they've become in recent times.
Yeah, I think zero and low is really interesting, and probably more than ever now. It's secured a significant market share in places like Europe. I guess I've always been a little bit, again, the historian in me, the huge rise of low alcohol or zero alcohol beers has been predicted in New Zealand for about the last 15 years or even longer. It never really gained momentum. I think it is now. And I think that's got a chunk to do with the fact that the beer available is of much better quality than the low alcohol or zero alcohol products used to be. I think the science has moved on significantly. So, yeah, I sense that the market will grow. Simply, again, it's a taste thing, and I think that is why a lot of people avoided some of the earlier versions. Yeah, it doesn't really taste like something that I want to call beer.
I think with the rise in low and no alcohol, it is actually, from supermarket data, one of the only, if not the only, part of the beer market that is actually growing in shelf space. You're right, I think a lot of it does have to do with the science. I know, for example, Garage Project, which was one of the first craft breweries to come out with a zero product, it was like a year, maybe slightly more, in the making and developing of that hazy 0%. So it does require a lot of technical skill. And while I personally drink a lot of no and low alcohol, I'm a shift worker, so if I want to enjoy beer, a lot of the time it can't have alcohol in it. But I'm wary of just how much it will grow, just in terms of the fact that it is not any cheaper. A 6-pack of 0% beer, for me, when I take it home, it's the same price as a 6-pack of like 5% craft beer as well. So I wonder how much that might influence its growth, but I think it is really exciting and is obviously something that craft breweries and also the big guys are investing in and seeing that there could be something there.
Yeah, I think I think it'll grow more than it has, but as I say, there's been predictions for many years, because the flip side over the years is that the higher end was growing too. It's the middle that was the 4% were what were falling away, and so again, it was that shift to, I think, for many people, quality rather than quantity.
I think also that change or the bettering of the flavour of the beers, they don't feel like you are having the diet version of something.
Exactly.
Right? And I think with GP, with Garage Project, you think about what they produce and the types of beers they produce. I think Tiny they make way more of that than anything else they produce. Mm-hmm. So the market's there, and obviously there's breweries and brewing companies spouting up that only do that. I think of state of play. Any other questions? I think we're getting to that. About that now. So I have something to read out, other than thanking you all for coming here, whether you just came for this or you've just been here today or you've come for the whole weekend. A huge thank you from Booktown, Karakatia, from the festival, from Featherston as a town itself. I think we triple in size at this time of year, which is no small feat. There is a book signing table out in the tent. I think we're going to drag Greg out, so if you want to buy his book and you want him to sign it, that's the time to do it. Though I did hear that there are 2 copies at the bookstore in Greytown that he signed, so if you miss out now.
Well, it was only because I saw that they had filed it in the right place, which was under social science rather than under food and drink, so historians are quite particular about things like that.